People are rallying for a third day.
Breaking news on the search for missing Winona mother.
Today we'll be covering the Bear Brook Murders, also known as the Allenstown Four. This mystery persisted over 4 decades and was just concluded a couple of years ago, but I still find it to be one of the most baffling and frustrating cases that I've researched on. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and let me paint you the picture. On November 10th of 1985, a hunter was walking through Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. This is a huge park, spanning around 10,000 acres wide, and it still stands as one of the largest parks in New Hampshire. Lots of residencies neighbored this area, and it offered a variety of activities like fishing, archery, and hiking trails. But the hunter is passing through one of the less frequented areas in the park, which has a couple of trees sprouting through the dead leaves. The foliage is sparse enough to make out the shape of the store that had burned down years ago. Now, the hunter is passing through when something catches his eye. It's a giant blue barrel, later described to be a metal 55-gallon drum, lying on its side just off the trail. The sight is obviously unusual, so he gets closer and crouches down to peer inside. He can see that something is wrapped in plastic, but as he gets closer, the odor grows unbearably putrid. Something is rotting, or has been rotting, for quite some time. He lifts the plastic and calls the police. The pale-faced hunter told them, "There's a barrel up in the woods, and I think there's some bones in there." The police later described what they found that day to be the bodies of 2 substantially decomposed bodies, partially skeletonized by that point. The police immediately got to work on this case, but it became evident that because of the extent of the decomposition on the 2 bodies, identifying them would prove to be a challenge. The police tried to use their dental records, but because the forensics in the 1980s was obviously less advanced than it is now, they didn't make much progress. One of the bodies was of an adult female, while the other was of a young girl. They both had signs of blunt force trauma to the head, so the police ruled it as their likely cause of death. They ultimately failed to identify who the 2 victims were, or who might have done this to them, and the case went cold. Fast forward 15 years after the first barrel was found on May 9th in the year 2000. New Hampshire State Trooper John Cody comes across another giant metal barrel during his patrol through Bear Brook State Park. "I peel back the plastic and I saw the white, I think I still was second guessing myself," he said. "I had to go back out to my car, get my flashlight, come back in and shine it, and then when I saw the bones, it was clear the bones belonged to children." So, the 4 bodies were all found in a similar fashion in the same park and apparently only 100 yards apart, so I really have no idea why the second barrel was found so long after the discovery of the first. It's also important to note that the second barrel had legs sticking out of the top, and yet nobody found the damn thing until 15 years later. Inside the barrel were the bodies of 2 young girls, both with blunt force trauma to the head, and these 2 bodies were almost completely skeletonized, but the connection between them and the other 2 mysterious murders was clear. The adult woman's DNA yielded that she was Caucasian with possible Native American roots, and her age likely ranged anywhere from 23 to 33 years. She was about 5'2" to 5'7" in stature with curly brown hair, and she likely had access to dental care because her teeth showed that she had multiple filling and extraction procedures done during her lifetime. The young girl found with her was estimated to have been anywhere from 5 to 11 years old, but definitely the older of the 3 children found. Her body showed signs that she had had pneumonia around the time of her death, and her hair was a wavy light brown color, and her dental records showed her teeth were crooked and her top front teeth had a small gap between them. She was found with earrings on both of her ears and was thought to have been around 4'3" to 4'6" in stature. The other 2 bodies found in the second barrel were of very young children. The presumably older of the 2 was between 2 to 4 years old with similarly brown hair. She had a gap between her front teeth and an overbite. She was shorter, around 3'8", and her DNA identified her as primarily Caucasian with Asian and Native American heritage. She also suffered from anemia during her lifetime, a condition in which the body doesn't supply enough healthy red blood cells and is primarily caused by an iron deficiency. The youngest girl was estimated to be around 1 to 3 years old at the time of her death, with light brown hair and a gap between her teeth. She was a mere 2'6" in stature, and forensics showed that although the bodies were found years apart, they were all slain at around the same time, between 1978 to 1981. The police were confronted with the realization that someone had killed 4 people and had not been caught for almost 20 years, but with no way to identify exactly who the victims were, they had no way to narrow down a suspect. They started their investigation by making forensic reconstructions of their face and releasing them to the public. Hundreds of reports and leads flowed into the police department as to who they might be from all over America and Canada, but they couldn't make out the exact identities of the bodies and instead narrowed down the search to around 10 people. In 2013, 13 years after the discovery of the second barrel, another facial reconstruction was made by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or the NCMEC. The researchers created a more in-depth version this time, and they took into consideration the effect that their dental configuration might have had on their overall face shape. This time, the image they released was in black and white, because while DNA did provide them with hair color and race, they had no way to tell what their skin tone or eye color was like. 1 year later, in 2014, the police made a breakthrough on the case as the DNA samples showed that the woman and 2 of the children were maternally related. Mitochondrial DNA tests, which, if you didn't know, mitochondrial DNA is always passed on from the mother's side, and it showed that the woman could have been the mother, aunt, or older sister of the oldest and the youngest child of the 3. This established a concrete familial bond, which narrowed down the pool of possible missing people by a lot. The middle child, however, did not show a DNA match with the other 3 victims, meaning that they had found the remains of 3 family members and 1 seemingly random child. So, up until this point, there really was no way to confirm who these people were. There weren't really any possible leads until in 2015, scientists confirmed that the older woman was the mother of the 2 children, and in 2017, an independent researcher named Rebecca Heath, who did some work on missing people's cases on the side, found that 2 people, one Marlise McWaters and her daughter Sarah, matched the age and location that the barrels were found. And she suggested that they might be 2 of the Allenstown Four on an online message board. This went largely disregarded, and no more follow-ups were made on the lead. The researcher eventually came across a woman who was looking for the 2 individuals and contacted her with a few questions. After a long back and forth, the person only yielded one name to have been in connection with Marlise and Sarah McWaters: Terry Rasmussen. At the same time, in 2018, the NCMEC received information about the 2 McWaters and their possible connection to the case. Marlise McWaters was last seen with her daughter, Sarah McWaters, around Thanksgiving in 1978. Now, as I continue to tell you about this case, you'll find that so much of this timeline is confusing because Marlise McWaters is not actually Marlise McWaters, and Terry Rasmussen, the person supposedly with relations to her, is not known as Terry Rasmussen. Throughout this case, we'll be examining the life and lives of his 6 different identities. Let's get into their early lives. Marlise was born in 1954 in Stamford, Connecticut as one Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, not Marlise McWaters. She was born the second oldest among 5 sisters and was adored by all of those who met her. She was described as having a bubbly or quirky personality and a great sense of humor by her sisters. Her younger sister remembers that her dream was to one day be a mother, even since she was little, so we know that she greatly valued family. She was described by those around her as someone who greatly loved her children. Unfortunately, when she was only 7 years old, her parents separated and her mom moved with her 3 younger siblings to California, while she and her older sister stayed with their father in Connecticut. Marlise's childhood was relatively uneventful until 1969, when she moved from Connecticut to stay with her mother and her new husband in La Mirada, California. She started attending Artesia High School this same year and changed her last name to her mother's to become Marlise Salomon. Only a year later, in 1970, Marlise was still 16 years old when she started dating her boyfriend, whom she married the next year at only 17 years old in Las Vegas. She took on his last name and became Marlise Elizabeth Vaughn. For the next year or so, Marlise and her husband jumped around California, during which their daughter, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, was born. The next year, the family stayed in Los Angeles for a while before they moved back to Connecticut to live with Marlise's father, where they stayed for approximately a year before they moved again, please save me, to Massachusetts. Eventually, the couple separated in 1973, and Marlise's husband took their daughter Marie back to California. There's kind of a little cut in the camera film as to Marlise's whereabouts during this period, but the next year, Marlise went to California to take their daughter back while her husband wasn't home. By the way, at this point, Marlise is still only 20 years old, and everything that just happened within like 3 years. I don't actually know what their family life was like or what caused them to separate, but as far as I'm aware, it's not that relevant to the case. The couple officially divorced after that, and Marlise was granted custody of their daughter Marie. Only a couple months after that, Marlise married her second husband in Cali, whose last name is McWaters, by the way, after which they moved to 4 different locations in California for the next 3 years. This was kind of a nightmare to research, and I'm actually redacting a lot of the redundant stuff because this family moves a lot. So Marlise became Marlise McWaters, and around this time, Marie came down with scarlet fever and visited a clinic to receive treatment for it. In case you forgot, the eldest child found with the adult woman's body had signs that she suffered from pneumonia, and occasionally the bacteria causing scarlet fever can spread to other areas of the body, causing infections in the neck, chest infections like pneumonia, or sepsis. Just putting that out there. It's about 5 months after this that Marlise's ex-husband, Mr. Vaughn, claimed that he last had contact with the two. In 1977, at 23 years old, Marlise gave birth to her second daughter, Sarah Lynn McWaters. Only 1 year after this rosy, chubby baby was born, Marlise and Mr. McWaters separate for reasons unknown to us, and Marlise is only granted reasonable visitation rights to Sarah. Later, though, Mr. McWaters started dating someone else, during which time Sarah was not observed to be under their custody, so Sarah was probably with Marlise long term. So, recap, Marlise had 2 babies by 2 different baby daddies, but her missing persons profile reported her as Marlise Elizabeth McWaters, so when she still shared the last name of her second husband. In the Thanksgiving of 1978, Marlise and her 2 children visited her family for the holidays, where she introduced them to someone named Terry Rasmussen. Their family was not pleased at all, and from the next door, you could hear Marlise and her mother reportedly ending up fighting over the matter. Her mother thought that Terry was much too old for her, and they'd never met this 35-year-old Terry person before, and they would never meet him again. After this visit, the mother and 2 daughters were never seen again. Marlise McWaters was reported missing in 1978 at 24 years old. Moving on, Terrence Peter Rasmussen was born in December 23rd of 1943 in Denver, Colorado. He attended Whittier Elementary School for 4 years, starting when he was around 10 or 11 years old. And when he was 15 years old, Terry moved to Phoenix, Arizona with his family, where he attended North High School until he eventually dropped out in sophomore year. Not much is known about his family life, or if he exhibited any early signs of abnormality, but the reports don't indicate that he was an intentionally troublesome or malicious kid. Only 2 years after that, at 17, he decided to enlist in the U.S. Navy. No one has much information on what his peers in high school thought about him, or his fellow soldiers' assessment of his character, but regardless, after 6 years of serving, he was discharged in 1967 at 24 years old. He didn't have a job, and he hadn't completed his high school education, so instead of moving back to Phoenix, he moved to Hawaii, where he worked at the shoe shop that his parents owned. It was during this time that he met his first wife, whose name has surprisingly never been identified, and they married in 1968. This next year, the family moved back to Phoenix, Arizona, where the 2 children were born, and during this time, Rasmussen worked as an electrician under a boss named Otto, although which company he worked for has not been identified either. I struggled to find info on this guy, but anyways, a year later, Rasmussen's entire family moved to California, where he continued his work as an electrician, and the couple saw the birth of their third child and son, but their family life was far from happy. Reportedly, in one specific event, Rasmussen put out his cigarette on one of his sons and was physically abusive to the entire family. 2 years later, the couple have their fourth child, a daughter, but they have a temporary period of separation, so it's safe to say that life at home was pretty rocky. In 1973, Rasmussen moves back to Phoenix, Arizona for like the millionth time and juggles a couple different jobs with his old boss Otto and at a shoe shop. I'm not sure whether this is the same shoe shop that his parents owned or a different one, but the guy was making some shoes. In the same year, he was arrested by Maricopa County Sheriff's Office for the first time in a long list of crimes to come for aggravated assault. At this point, the couple are still separated, and he gets arrested again for the same crime in 1975, and his wife grew sick of being married to the old bum and left him, taking her 4 young children with her. Now, so far, it sounds like he doesn't even know of Marlise Honeychurch or her daughter Sarah, and he never even met them by this point in the story, right? Well, a year later, in 1976, Rasmussen goes to see his family in Payson, Arizona, but this time he's reportedly accompanied by another woman during this visit, and this is the last time that his family ever sees him. 2 years later, the divorce is finalized, and Rasmussen's workplace receives a notice that he quit to work elsewhere. So the timelines collide, and it's 1978, and both people are missing. Marlise took her 2 daughters with her, while Terry had none of his children with him, but 7 years later, 4 females end up dead in a metal barrel. We know that Marlise took Marie and Sarah with her because there was a picture of Marie taken on her 7th or 8th birthday. And by the way, from this point on, I'm just going to call Marie, their first child, the first child that Marlise had, as Vaughn, because Marlise and Marie sound really similar and they have the same middle name. So Marlise, Vaughn, Sarah, and Terry are presumably MIA together around 1978 or 1979. But they're not dead or missing, they just completely switched identities. Terry Rasmussen changed his name to Bob Evans or Robert Evans, and Marlise changed her name to Elizabeth Evans. So scratch what I just recapped. Address records showed that an Elizabeth Evans, Bob Evans, Vaughn, and Sarah were now living together in New Hampshire, home to the Bear Brook State Park. So Bob goes back to working as an electrician, but in 1980, this guy gets arrested 3 times in the same year for a fraudulent check, theft of services, and illegally diverting an electric current. I'm not sure. So anyways, we know that these 4 were living together because the addresses that Bob and Elizabeth provided were of the same house, and each time Bob got arrested, his spouse was listed as Elizabeth Evans, but the photos were undoubtedly of Terry and Marlise. But the year's 1981, a year after his last arrest, and Elizabeth Evans is nowhere to be found. Instead, our buddy Bob is attending Thanksgiving at the house of his girlfriend, Denise Bowden, who is a completely different person from Marlise, by the way. Elizabeth Evans is seemingly missing, and Bob Evans is now dating Denise Bowden, who goes missing shortly afterward as well. Authorities believe Rasmussen may have brought Bowden out to California and killed her there, though her body was never recovered, so we'll never know. But 3 years later, Bob Evans is no longer, and instead emerges Curtis Mayo Kimball, with the same face, but a different name in his contract to another electrical company in California. The next year, Kimball was charged with a DUI and was arrested for the 6th time, which is how we know that this was the 3rd identity that Terry Rasmussen assumed. The year is now 1985, and if you remember, shortly after, the first barrel is located in Bear Brook State Park with the remains of an adult woman and her eldest daughter inside. I really wish I could provide you with what actually happened before they were discovered that way, but I can't because the prime suspect in this case, who was taken into custody and did most likely commit these murders and more, never provided a confession detailing what he did. So all of these missing women's death, well, most likely remain a mystery. In January of 1986, Curtis Kimball has gone under yet again and quit his job at his old electrical company. Rasmussen then assumed the identity of someone named Gordon Jensen. and was now working at the Holiday Host RV Park in Scotts Valley, California. We know this is true because the fingerprints later checked by the police are identical between these two people. It was during this identity era that the police received a report of a young child abandoned all by herself. The child was later identified as a girl named Lisa, the daughter of Denise Bowden, and when she was asked where her parents were, it quickly became clear that her father had abandoned her and fled. Her mother, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. It was later revealed that Rasmussen had left 6-year-old Lisa with an elderly couple, and instead of coming back after the period he had promised, he just drove off. When asked if she had siblings, Lisa replied that she did, but that they had died from eating grass mushrooms when they were out camping. I think another unsettling part about this case is that we can't confirm exactly how many victims there are, and while 4 bodies were found, if all of the disappearances are linked to the same person, that number could be so much more. By the way, in case you were wondering, Lisa's sibling is likely not the unidentified middle child, because while Rasmussen lied and told the police that he was indeed Lisa's father, DNA results showed that Lisa was the child of Denise and someone else, not Terry. The police tried looking for her father who had left her, but they would fail to locate Rasmussen for the next 2 years. A little silver lining is that little Lisa was taken into protective custody after this and eventually got adopted. In November of 1988, Rasmussen is pulled over in San Luis Obispo, California, because he was driving a stolen vehicle that he had somehow hauled all the way from Idaho. Honestly, if this guy didn't constantly get arrested left and right for the pettiest crimes, I'm sure he would have never been caught for his other big ones. This time he wasn't Gordon Jensen, though. He was under the name Jerry Mockerman this time. But still, no one was suspecting Terry Rasmussen, Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, Gordon Jensen, or Jerry Mockerman for any of the Bear Brook murders. He got arrested on the spot and was sentenced to 3 years in jail for child abandonment. But surprise, surprise, the next year he was set free on parole for literally leaving a child to rot. How good does the good behavior have to be to get let off that easy? So that entire thing was crazy, but our guy Terry has shed his old ways and he's made himself a new man, quite literally, because this dumbass gets pulled over 8 years later for not having his driver's license, except now he's Lawrence William Vanner. 2 things shocked me about this guy's unbreakable pattern. Number 1, it's that one man can go about changing his identity 5 different times without the US cops ever catching on. And second, it's that there's seemingly no reason for him to change his name so often unless it's his idea of fun, or he keeps killing in between these periods. So the guy gets arrested like 7 times. At this point, I'm not really keeping count anymore, and no one suspects a thing. He gets off every single time. There's no warrant out for his arrest, he's not on the suspect list, no one even connects him to all these different missing women, even though he's been seen with all of them and he hasn't even left California this whole time. The very next year, Rasmussen was still living as Larry Vanner when he met his last girlfriend and sadly his next victim, a young Korean chemist named Eunsoon Jun, who was an incredibly intelligent woman who loved creating pottery in her free time and loved the people around her deeply. She introduced him to her family as the man she loved, and they moved in together into her California home. The next year was when the second barrel with the 2 young girls was found in the same Bear Brook State Park. You've probably already figured out that 3 of the 4 victims are likely Marlise, Vaughn, and Sarah, but the other child still remains a mystery. We'll get more into that later. So I mentioned that Eunsoon deeply cared for the people around her, but they started to notice that after the 2 moved in together, Eunsoon was dwindling in contact with them. Eunsoon did end up marrying Larry, if you will, in a little unofficial ceremony in her backyard, which was cute, but that didn't distract from the fact that something was seriously messed up. Her friends kept asking where she was, and Rasmussen would just give them excuse after excuse, saying that, oh, she went to care for a sick mother, or, oh, she's off checking on one of our other properties. They kept trying to reach out until in 2002, when she suddenly just cut off contact completely. At that point, all of her friends, they just got fed up with his crap and called the cops on his ass, who just got to searching his home right away. Remember how I told you that I couldn't give you details on the Allenstown Four? Well, tragically, there are plenty of details about Eunsoon's death. In one of the crawl spaces in the house, which if you don't know what a crawl space is, it's utterly horrifying, so I'm going to add a photo here. Filling up this thin area between the ground and the first floor was just the biggest pile of cat litter, stacked and stacked. This was obviously highly unusual, so the police got to digging, and after a long excavation, they found a mummified foot with the flip-flops still on it. Police were horrified, but they still had the rest of her to find, so they kept digging. Slowly but surely, they were making progress, but they weren't pulling up a whole corpse. No, they were pulling out dismembered body parts one at a time because the body was completely cut up into pieces. It took them a while to find enough to identify the collection of body parts as the murdered Eunsoon. Later, they identified that she had, similarly to his other victims, died of blunt force trauma to the head and was later dismembered. Now, at this point, nobody had connected him to the Allenstown Four, but the pattern was clearly there. Many people call him cunning or evil genius because he managed to evade the police for over 20 years, but I've said this and I'll say it again, this guy is unbelievably stupid. At first, he tried denying that it was him that killed Eunsoon, but there was footage and records of him buying 10 liters of cat litter at the local supermarket. They didn't even own any cats, by the way, and you may be wondering why this idiot bought so many bags of cat litter, which eventually got traced back to him. But for all you non-cat owners, there was some thought behind this. Some amount of thought. You see, cat litter isn't just random sand in a bag, it's actually specifically manufactured to reduce the odor of cat poops. Otherwise, they would stink up your whole house. You can get them in different scents, baby powder, lavender, whatever. So call him cunning, call him psychopathic, but Rasmussen likely got the cat litter to suppress the putrid and unmistakable odor of a deteriorating corpse. And considering how much bigger a corpse is than cat poop, he would need at least 10 liters. So in 2002, he finally gets arrested and they fingerprint him, and because this dumb bastard got arrested in literally every corner of the country, they had records of his fingerprint as Bob, Jerry, Larry, and whatever, and they all matched. So the police were obviously confused because this guy was clearly up to something if he was changing his identity that many times. So they started connecting him to some of the other prominent cases that coincided with the time and location that he had been in each state, but they made one fatal mistake, and they for some reason couldn't connect him to Terry Rasmussen, his original name, who was considered a missing person, and obviously they couldn't make the connection between him and the Allenstown Four because he was missing with Marlies. So Terry Rasmussen gets arrested but is not tried in court as a serial killer. He pleads guilty, and by some twisted miracle, this guy gets only 15 years behind bars for murdering and chopping up his wife. And he doesn't even serve the full sentence because in 2010, a mere 7 years later, and half of a sentence, by the way, this worthless idiot finds mercy through the not-so-swift death of lung cancer at 67 years old. It's probably from all the cigarettes he smoked. 7 years later, it's revealed that he was actually Terry Rasmussen, and the police were able to announce in 2019 that the Allenstown Four were Marlies Elizabeth Honeychurch, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, Sarah Lynn McWaters, and the middle child, who was DNA-wise Rasmussen's daughter, but not related to the other 3 victims biologically. He's known today all across America as the Chameleon Killer for his ability to assimilate into so many different identities to commit his crimes. So one last mystery remains. Who is the unidentified one, the girl now known only as the middle child? Throughout this confusing timeline, you might have deduced that she is one of Rasmussen's children from his first marriage, but if you remember, the forensic evidence showed that the middle child died when she was 2 to 4 years old, but Rasmussen's youngest daughter was born in 1971, so she was at least 7 years old by 1978 to 1981, the presumed time frame of their deaths. She's not one of Lisa's siblings since Lisa was not related to Rasmussen, and if she had any older siblings, they likely weren't his either. any younger children they had after Lisa would have been born after 1981, which was when 6-month-old Lisa showed up with Denise at their family's home. So it wouldn't make sense that Rasmussen's biological child would be found in the same barrel as baby Sarah. Now, if you remember at the beginning, I mentioned how all 4 Allenstown victims had lived in the same region around 2 weeks before their deaths, but the mysterious middle child was shown to have spent the majority of the childhood somewhere around Arizona, Texas, or California, so more southwest, and if you remember, a lot of the story takes place in California. Ultimately, we'll never really know unless someone claims the child, but because of the strange time of her conception, it is unlikely that this will ever happen. It doesn't really matter though. Just because her name isn't said or her family isn't found, it doesn't mean that she never existed. Now that the police knew who at least 3 of the victims were, they made one last facial recreation of the girls in full color. 2 of the Allenstown Four were laid to rest in St. John the Baptist Cemetery in Allenstown, New Hampshire in 2019. Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace and God's loving care. So throughout this video, I was painting a picture of Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. I wanted to draw the rest of the victims as well, but sadly I have no knowledge of how to draw children and babies, so I'm going to be inserting a photo of all of them here. I know the drawing is not perfect, but I hope it did her justice to some extent. So, that was the entire case of the Bear Brook murders. I was kind of nervous. This is my first video, and this was a pretty heavy and dark one to get into, and a pretty unsatisfying one, I know, for many, because in the end we never really got enough closure on who that middle child was or what had happened to these 4 women. Because we know where they ended up, how they ended up, and, well, we know how they were found, but we never really got a full picture of how it happened. You know, we never really got a proper confession from Terry Rasmussen, and he eventually, ultimately, found mercy through death, and may God forgive his soul, because I know a lot of us won't, ever. Anyways, thank you for listening, and if I have time next week, I will post again. Thank you so much for staying with me through this giant video. Yeah. Okay, bye.